Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's Art in Conversation. Also, before I start the official welcome, I would like to do a visual description. Visual description is something that we are trying to get in the practice of here at the Portland Art Museum when we run programs. It is a way of making sure that our blind and low vision audience members have a sense of who we are as speakers. So I'll do my visual description. I'll first introduce myself. My name is Eliza Johnston, and I work in the Learning and Community Partnerships Department. I'm a Black woman. I have black hair that's currently braided into a side braid. I'm wearing hoop earrings. I'm wearing a kind of earth tone, kind of tannish shirt and a gray sweater. I have black rimmed glasses, and I am sitting in a blue room, and behind me are two brown bookcases, almost full with books. All right, and I want to welcome everybody to this month's Art in Conversation. To give you a little bit of background for people that are new to the program that maybe haven't attended before. Before quarantine, Art in Conversation, Art in Conversation is a program that's been running for over 40 years. And before quarantine, we used to meet in person, always on the third Tuesday of every month. We would have the first hour for donuts and coffee, kind of a social hour for people to meet each other. And then we'd have the last hour as a lecture that would usually spotlight some sort of exhibition that we have in the museum. But in addition to that, we would also invite outside organizations and artists to come and talk about their work within the larger Portland community. And then following the program, everybody would be able to go into the museum for free and look at whatever exhibitions were on view at the time. This time around, during our moment of quarantine, it's a little different. We're coming to you through Zoom webinar and through Facebook Live. And we're happy to still be able to offer this program. And we are very happy to talk about and spotlight exhibitions that are on view, both physically within the museum as well as online. We have an online exhibition up of Volcano as well. And so that being said, I would like to introduce our speaker today, and I'm really, really excited. We have Dawson Carr with us, who will be talking about Volcano. Dawson is the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art. Dawson joined the Portland Art Museum in January of 2013 as the museum's first full-time curator of European painting and sculpture. He is responsible for the research, documentation, and interpretation of art made in Europe from antiquity to 1900, as well as the organization of exhibitions and the development of the collection. And with that, I would like to thank you and welcome you, Dawson.
Thanks, Jaleesa.
Dawson, you muted yourself.
There we go. Thanks, Jaleesa. I should say before we begin that I am a white man, almost bald, tightly cropped hair, in a blue shirt, on a bluish gray jacket, and I wear glasses. And now, just a little housekeeping. Does that look good, Jaleesa?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the exhibition Volcano, Mount St. Helens in Art, was developed to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Great Eruption on May the 18th, 1980. We were only open about 6 weeks of our 3-month planned run. But when we shut down in March, we approached the lenders to the exhibition to see if we might prolong it. And as you can see, it will be prolonged through the 3rd of January, 2021. And we're very grateful to all of those lenders. And every single one of them was immensely supportive. And so we're very grateful for that. Before we get into the exhibition, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the representation of volcanoes in art. Um, when you're speaking of European art, of course, the great volcano is Mount Vesuvius outside Naples. And here you see the first known representation of Mount Vesuvius, a fresco from the House of the Centenary in Pompeii. And we see the volcano, and beside it is Bacchus wearing a cloak of grapes. Bacchus was, of course, the god of wine, and you can see vineyards up the slopes. And right here at the start, we need to emphasize that volcanoes do bring destruction, but also with it regeneration and wonderful fertilization. Wines are still being made from grapes grown on Mount Vesuvius to this day. They produce wonderful, wonderful whites and reds. And this is, of course, a very special instance because in this case, we have this beautifully preserved Roman fresco, and it was, of course, preserved by being buried by its subject in the eruption in the year 79. Vesuvius was quiet, largely. Maybe there was a little blip occasionally, but it was mostly quiet until 1632 when it erupted with a vengeance. And that initiated a 300-year period of eruptive activity, only ending in 1944, just as the Allied forces were reaching Naples. In the 18th century, it erupted quite a bit, and it drew people from all over Europe to experience what they called the sublime, grand events, events that were overwhelming to the senses. And of course, volcanic eruptions are nature's most visually spectacular manifestations of power. Many of you will remember seeing this wonderful work by Voltaire from our exhibition, Seeing Nature, landscape painting from the collection of Paul Allen. And in it, we see people fleeing across the Magdalena Bridge and down and into Naples. And here a monk leading the populace in prayer for the cessation of the eruption. Voltaire made eruptions of Vesuvius somewhat a speciality. And he found in time that this kind of picture was not really what the people, the tourists, wanted. What they wanted was to see themselves witnessing this incredible event, as you see in this depiction from the Art Institute of Chicago. In these representations of Vesuvius, we get the hot light emanating from the volcano and its lava, juxtaposed with a beautiful, serene moon. And the moon is often included to balance out. The volcano was, of course, an unpredictable force of nature, while the moon was regular and very beautiful in the night sky. It wasn't just erupting volcanoes. Volcanoes were depicted because they're often beautiful shapes. Etna here is puffing away. Etna's Europe's most active volcano. It's almost always active. And for that reason, it doesn't have quite the spectacular eruptions of Vesuvius. Very few European painters got down to Sicily to see and depict Mount Etna. And by far the finest depictions of it are by the American Thomas Cole, as you see in this example made from the Roman ruins at Taormina. It wasn't just European volcanoes that were depicted. The great American Frederick Church traveled to Ecuador and here depicts Cotopaxi, an almost 20,000 foot volcano, a pure, beautiful cone erupting, and as you can see, blotting out the light of the sun. Church completed this work in his New York studio, and when it was first shown in New York in 1862, all the critics interpreted it in the same way, and they all saw it as an allegory of the Civil War and the light of the sun being blotted out temporarily and with the hope of clearing to come. And of course, it isn't just represented in Western culture. The eruption of Mount Bondi in 1888 killed hundreds of people. You can see a house flying through the air here. And this is just one of quite a few representations of that eruption. Fuji last erupted at the end of the 18th century, and there are almost no depictions of that. And of course, it continues into the present day. Here, Andy Warhol in one of his wonderful screen prints of Vesuvius made in the mid-1980s. So finally, we get to Mount St. Helens, and many of you will remember the mountain as it appears in this photograph. You can see it, also beautiful conical shape, and we see Spirit Lake and the dense old growth forest that surrounded and characterized the area before the eruption. Mount St. Helens was a sacred place to Native Americans for time immemorial. And its relationship to other volcanoes in the area figured in many, many stories about the volcano. We see here Mount Hood in the foreground, Mount St. Helens, Rainier, and Adams. And in some of these stories, every tribe in the area has its own stories, and they don't always necessarily agree. Sometimes, for instance, Mount St. Helens is male, sometimes female. Sometimes St. Helens and Rainier are paired in these stories as husband and wife, spitting fire back and forth at each other. Sometimes Mount St. Helens is female and a wife, one of several wives who battle with each other. Mount St. Helens is known as Lawitlatla to the Cowlitz people as well as the Yakima Nation. This is a name, it gets shortened later into Luit, a name that most of you know. And Mount St. Helens, Lawitlatla, is sacred particularly to the Cowlitz people because it is the most prominent landmark of their ancestral lands. Native Americans didn't depict Mount St. Helens, but they did use the stuff of the volcano, the substance. In this case, I'm showing you several basalt objects from our collection. Basalt is the most common igneous rock. It's laid down in layers on top of the land, and depending on the composition of the lava, very different kinds of stone are produced. I'm sorry the beautiful condor vase is being slightly obliterated by our images on the right, but you can see in this case the lava had a lot of gas in it. The earliest known depictions of Mount St. Helens date from the mid-1840s. The first was made by Henry James Ware, who was a British spy sent to the area to try to determine if the British nation could win a war against the United States for the Oregon Territory. The whole matter was, of course, settled the following year in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty that established the 49th parallel as the boundary between the two nations. Ware happened to be in the area and witness an eruption from the north side of the volcano. We are right here at the Port of Longview today, looking at the mountain. 2 years later, the Canadian salvage ethnographer Paul Kane passed through the area mainly documenting Native American life and customs. Salvage ethnographers, this is a 19th century movement, believed that these people were going to die out. And so it was very much trying to record things that would ultimately disappear. Of course, that did not happen very much, and we're very grateful, particularly to the Cowlitz people, for their great help in preparing our exhibition. Kane passed through and also witnessed an eruption of steam and ash on the north side of the volcano. This was close to the end of the eruptive period that began in the early 19th century and lasted into the 1850s. When he got back home to Toronto, he created this oil painting. And as you see, he observed this steam and ash eruption in daylight. And when he got back to Toronto and made the painting, he turns it into a nocturnal scene that's very, very fiery, with a group of Native Americans in canoes observing from the water. The reason that he did this was that he had made his own tour of Europe, and he knew representations like the Francesco Fidanza painting in our collection of Vesuvius. And so he wanted to create this very visually dramatic scene. In this case, Native Americans these are Turks in the foreground who were well known in Naples because it was a great trading center. So you get the idea. You can't believe this as documentation. The sketches, yes, but this is very much a creation of the artist. By the 1880s, Portland was developing and people were wanting images of the great peaks of the Cascades to display in their homes and offices. William Samuel Parrott was a very distinguished early painter in Portland, and he creates this luminous view of the mountain, the snow-covered and juxtaposed with the green in the foreground. One of his pupils was Grace Russell Fountain, who became a very distinguished painter in her own right. And here you see again the mountain with very, very subtle depictions of light playing off it, the hills in between, and the water in the foreground. This kind of painting is quintessentially American. American Luminism, it's known as, and here you see one of the representatives of the Hudson River School doing Lake George, and you get the idea of the kind of painting which local painters adopted as well. One of the great Hudson River School painters visited our area twice. Albert Bierstadt created this view in about 1889 when he passed through. It's his only known depiction of Mount St. Helens. There is another one out there somewhere. It was described as a beautiful sketch in the late 19th century, but I couldn't find it to save my soul. And here you get the idea, very atmospheric, haze over the landscape beneath the mountain. We see only a pair of deer observing the scene. In most of these paintings, there is an absence of human presence in an otherwise pristine landscape. Bierstadt, of course, made many views of our area and created numerous depictions of Mount Hood. And at this point, I wanted to tell you that representations of Mount St. Helens are very rare in comparison with those of Mount Hood. It would seem that Portland, then the great metropolitan area in this part of the world, that Portlanders really wanted representations of Mount Hood because they could visit it. They could go there, they could climb it, they could picnic there, and while Mount St. Helens was much more inaccessible in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This, of course, from our collection, and I should say this is about 6 to 8 times the size of his depiction of Mount St. Helens. I wanted to show you one more depiction by a painter who was very much alive and practicing when Bierstadt came through in the 1890s, Eliza Barcas. Barcas is a very special case. She was a prolific artist. She had to support a large family after her husband died very young. And she created a business here in Portland and created wonderful oil paintings on board, like Bierstadt's, made for an upscale market. But she created works for all levels of the market. This is a work painted on slate that was made for the tourist market, essentially. And it shows Mount St. Helens at sunset, a beautiful depiction. People have really enjoyed seeing this very fresh and well executed depiction of the mountain. I should say that when it was made about 1920, it was one of the last works of Eliza Barcas. It's late in her career because she suffered from arthritis as well as failing eyesight. As you can see, she lived on another almost 40 years, dying at age 102. If you don't know Eliza Barcas, I would suggest you check her out online. She's a fascinating artist. One final thing I should mention is she was one of the pioneers of color postcards. Most of the representations I've shown you so far don't include a human presence. And here we have a panoramic view of the burgeoning city of Portland about 1887, made by a Swedish immigrant, Olof Grafström, who arrived in 1886. This is an 8-foot wide painting. It's quite an impressive thing. And those of you who came to see the exhibition early, that is before we locked down in mid-March, didn't see this painting. I only became aware of it the day before we opened. And very kindly, the local collectors, even though they had just bought it, agreed to part with it. And we were about to hang it when we shut down. It is up now. We did a bit of rearranging in the first room. And so there's something new for you to see when you come back. We're somewhere up in the West Hills, looking out at the city. There's the Willamette running through the middle. Notice no bridges at this point. There's a sliver of the Columbia with Vancouver, Washington, developing on the other side. And of course, Mount St. Helens, that's Rainier peeking out from behind, and Adams off to the right. And this is now installed so that you can see it from the Schnitzer Sculpture Court, and it draws you in and sets the stage for the exhibition that follows. The Impressionists also portrayed Mount St. Helens. Greta Allen is not from our area. She was only passing through. She was an East Coast painter, most of the time living in Boston. And she created this view, probably from Goose Hollow. I say that because she was a friend of the next artist, Clara Jane Stevens, and sometimes stayed with her when she visited the area. Clara Jane Stevens is a distinguished American Impressionist, and this work really shows that she could deftly move paint around. And it's a striking depiction of the mountain, and of course, it's highlighted by this telephone pole in the foreground. that signals that the once pristine landscape is now intruded upon by things of humans. There's a shot of the installation in the gallery looking from the Bierstadt hanging on a wall by itself into the next room, where we turn to the depictions of the eruptions of 1980. In this case, Hank Pander, who's been Portland's history painter for over 50 years now, is showing the eruption not of May the 18th, 1980, but the one on July the 22nd that year, in which the eruption plume is seen against a clear, bright summer sky. It's a really marvelous depiction. It normally hangs in a conference room in City Hall, and so very few people get to see it actually. So we're delighted to be able to include it in the exhibition. It shows the eruption. There were clouds streaking through the sky very discreetly that day. And on the glass tabletop in the foreground, Hank depicts objects of observation, just as the painting is observing this dramatic scene, with the eruption plume dwarfing the city below. One key point to this, and we should explain for younger listeners today, that these miniature television sets were all the rage in 1980. They represent the first step into miniaturization of consumer products. And they were very, very popular. And I love the way Hank uses the antenna to connect with the eruption plume. And of course, it's as though this grandiose scene is being reduced down to this tiny little screen. It's an evocation of the fact that our brains need to somehow process the grandiosity of something like a great eruption. In the exhibition, you'll find it juxtaposed with a large watercolor that Hank made that day on the 22nd of July, 1980, and which he used in preparing for the oil painting. There are a number of other works that Hank did of Mount St. Helens in the show. This work was created by Barbara Noah, an artist from Seattle, who was driving down regularly from the 27th of March when the eruptions began. And on the day of the big one, she noticed a change in attitude. Up until that point, she had found people in lawn chairs, lounging about, enjoying the scene as though the mountain were very benign. And on that day, the mood changed, of course, with this eruption that killed 57 people and destroyed everything for almost 20 miles to the north. And our need to personify such grandiose things, to create monsters out of them, are evoked in this painting, which depends, it's made on top of a USGS photograph, and we're absolutely delighted to have it in the show. People have been really enjoying seeing this kind of tongue-in-cheek depiction of the sublime, that sense of pleasurable terror that accompanies something like an eruption. I'm sorry to say that this wonderful work by the well-known Chicago imagist Roger Brown is not in the exhibition. I tried my best to find it and enlisted the help of all sorts of people, but we just could not locate it. Roger Brown has a wry sense of humor, and as you can see, he gives it the title, First Continental Eruption. And of course, it was hardly that. Native Americans had known about eruptions for time immemorial. But For all of the recently settled people in the area, it was quite a surprise. And you can see people gesticulating in the apartment buildings that flank the scene, and in the landscape where we're reduced to little figures like ants in this wonderful depiction of the mountain. His work drew upon images from self-taught artists, but he was also really devoted to Art Deco theaters and the like, which you can see in this representation. Lucinda Parker is another well-known Portland artist. She made this work in 1980, calling it Magma Opus, and she created it as a model for a wall painting up at PSU. It was for a competition that she didn't win, and I at least have not been able to determine if anyone did win the competition and it was carried out. I'm afraid that's been lost to time. If any of you know, let me know. But it shows Lucinda's incredible energy, and we can only be sorry that it didn't get created on a large scale. This painting was made last year, toward the end of last year, by Lucinda. She calls it the Seething Saint. Lucinda's very fascinated with mountains, particularly Mount Hood, but also Mount St. Helens. And once again, her works are just charged with this marvelous energy. And I call this color Lucinda Parker yellow. It's one of her favorites. This is the only series of paintings that I know created after the sequential time-lapse photographs of the eruption. In this case, the Seattle artist Ryan Molenkamp was inspired by these images made by contractor Vern Hodgson on that day and published by the Everett Herald. At that point, Ryan Molenkamp was living in a town near Everett, and or at least he hadn't been born yet in 1980, but the Everett Herald published a book. And he was fascinated by these photographs. For those of you who don't know Ryan's work, you should check him out online. He's a real volcano nut, and he's created a large series of painting entitled Fear of Volcanoes. This sequence of 3 works is entitled Vancouver, Vancouver, This Is It. Those were the final words of the volcanologist David Johnston, who was the first to die on May the 18th, 1980. Another Portland artist profoundly affected by the eruption was George Johansen. At the time of the eruption, George was looking to retire and was looking for a sign that that's what he should do. He had been teaching at the Museum Art School for decades, and he really wanted to devote himself entirely to his work. And so when the mountain blew, that was the sign. And from then on, the erupting volcano became a leitmotif in George's works. Whenever he depicts Portland, we can see the erupting volcano. And in this case, he fashions himself as a baby, reborn in retirement. And those of you who know George know this is absolutely a portrait. There you see a wonderful large work by George, where he depicts an eruption that the likes of which did not happen in our lifetimes, showing a fiery fireworks kind of eruption behind, imagining that. And in the world of George's paintings, mirrors are not only reflective, but also transparent. And everyone in the scene is occupied, not watching the eruption, except for the lone figure of the artist behind. Many of you know George's big mural depicting Portland in the Multnomah County Library. And this work was made in that technique on ceramic tiles. And George is just having a great time playing off of the shape of the eruption plume, echoing it in the hot air balloons, the paddle of the kayaker, and the jets of water from the tug. After the eruption, in the section of the exhibition is entitled appropriately, After the Cataclysm, the mountain was treated by a number of different artists, but most especially by photographers. And black and white photography was the perfect medium for recording the devastation because, of course, this verdant green landscape had been, the color had just been wiped out of it. And black and white photography captures the most subtle nuances of light and texture and was absolutely perfect for showing this, the area afterward. Emmett Gowan had won a fellowship from the state of Washington to photograph in the state. And when the mountain blew that May, he turned his attention from other things onto Mount St. Helens and returned again and again to portray the mountain. He's one of the most distinguished landscape photographers in America today. Also, Frank Golke, another very distinguished landscape photographer, came down and worked over almost 10 years around the mountain, recording what he could see. We're now looking from the mountain to the north, seeing that Spirit Lake in the upper right-hand corner, and we see that the area with all that dense old growth forest had been scoured down to the bedrock by the blast on May the 18th. These photographs becoming quasi-abstract. Back to Emmett Gowan, who in 1980, from a plane, recorded this view, chilling view of the ash-laden Toutle River, with here the evidence of the blowdown of trees. The effect of ash, this is 4 years later, and from a plane, he captured this truly quasi-abstract view of the confluence of the Cowlitz and Columbia rivers. You can only make out this barge with logs here, a road up here, and otherwise the swirling of all of this ash out into the Columbia. The ash was used by glass artists to create wonderful works. And the ash was 67% silica. Paul Marioni is a very great glass artist. And he and his friend Rob Adamson got in the car that day, drove to Eastern Washington, collected a barrel of the ash and came back to Seattle. And that night, Paul blew this beautiful vase. As you can see, it's almost black. It's a very, very deep green. And the color that you're seeing here came from metallic fuming agents applied at the very end. Most of the glass produced was in the realm of souvenirs. And here we see a couple of ash trays made from the ash, one by the Bullseye Studio here in Portland, and the other by Glass Eye Studio in Seattle. Glass Eye in Seattle has made Mount St. Helens ash a leitmotif of their works. They include a little bit of it in all that they do. This mistake made a wonderful little sculpture, and Paul Marioni noticed it in the studio, picked it up and saved it, and later gave it to the Tacoma Art Museum. The motif that really most compelled artists after the eruption was the blowdown of the old growth forests. You see in this wonderful photograph from Mark Rudell, where our only point of reference is really the logging roads into the area. And again, from above, Marilyn Bridges. Marilyn Bridges was not only the photographer, but she also flew her own plane and created wonderful aerial views. We've got 4 from our own collection in the exhibition. And here you can see an eddy within the blast force aiming off to the left. The blowdown of trees greatly impressed the artist Charles Arnoldi, who created this work. He made a few like this in the aftermath of the eruption. If you know his work, most often they look like this. They're highly colored, perforated so that you can see through to the wall. And so you get that he was moved by the blowdown of trees, the splintering of trees, and here he's created these splintered sticks laid in on the left amid blackness as if burned, and on the right as if ash laden. I should say, this is, for those of you who haven't visited, this is 6 feet tall. It's a very impressive work. Diane Cook and Len Jensel are well known to most of you from the pages of National Geographic and many other publications. They happened on to this scene at Spirit Lake in 2009, and they happened to be there after the logs floating in the lake were coated with a thin dusting of snow to make this wonderful photograph of the volcano off in the distance at center. And to remind you that we're not looking at twigs in Spirit Lake, we included this wonderful photograph by Buzzy Sullivan that shows that these were truly giant trees. If you remember, the level of Spirit Lake went up and then slowly down again, and this was a log that was beached on the shore of the lake. In 1981, Hank Pander, who did the wonderful view of the eruption as seen from Portland, and his friend, the author Ursula K. Le Guin, were able to finagle passes into the red zone around the mountain. And they presented themselves as artists wanting to experience it, and sure enough, the authorities came through and let them in. And Hank did this wonderful 50-inch wide pen and ink drawing of his friend reaching out almost in disbelief at the scene that surrounded her. Those of you who are familiar with Le Guin's works of science fiction and fantasy know that she imagined very different forms of life on other worlds. And so in this depiction, Hank included the 6th moon of Saturn, Enceladus, an ice moon. And that was because at the time of their visit in October 1981, Voyager 2 had just sent back the first close-up images of Enceladus. So it ended up in time that it was a more appropriate inclusion in this portrait of Le Guin than either of them could have imagined at the time. Cassini was able to fly through one of the ice geysers emanating from the surface of Enceladus, and it detected salt water. And they now know that there is a vast ocean under the ice of salt water. And so this is very tantalizing to scientists who are imagining primitive forms of life developing in those deep seas. We were able to include, Le Guin was more than a bit obsessed with Mount St. Helens. She could see it from her study window, and she created artworks of her own. She writes about this, saying that words failed, and to try to get at the mountain, she would create these lovely pastels. And thanks to her family, we're able to include 6 of them in the exhibition. Here's one of them made on March the 30th. That's 3 days after the eruptions began, depicting the erupting mountain. We have images that she made before and after as well. The last section of the exhibition deals with the volcano as an active landscape. This wonderful photograph by Frank Golke was made inside the crater, and you can see he managed to snap the shutter right at the moment of this rock fall that creates this rooster tail of dust bouncing off the mountain. He described it as the most otherworldly place he had ever been. For artist Brad Johnson, his photograph of the crater, he also climbs up with some regularity to be in the crater, that those photographs alone were not enough to express the experience of being there. And so he has overlaid an image of the crater with this form. When I went to visit him in his studio in Trout Lake, this work drew me across the room. And at first I saw a tornado or a volcano turned on its head, maybe an eruption plume. And those of you who know symbolism in art, the cone or pyramid are symbols of great strength, again, turned on its head, but that wasn't his inspiration. As you can see from the title, Mount St. Helens Thin Place refers to the Celtic idea that there are places on the earth that are so thin that the margins between heaven and earth are incredibly close. Brad's source of inspiration for this work was, in fact, Sandro Botticelli's map of hell based on Dante's description in the Inferno, where you see people being funneled down ever deeper. Where you landed in this trajectory depended on how heinous your sin was, and there's Lucifer at the bottom. Pardon me. I urge you to visit Brad's website. He's moved on from this and has created a number of other works, both in the Thin Place series and otherwise. Do visit Brad's website. This last part of the exhibition shows the rebirth of nature in the landscape. And these are 2 photographs made 9 years apart by Frank Golke. The one at the top in 1981, the one at the bottom in 1990, and you can see nature rebounding. Although the blast from the volcano was very destructive, beautiful new landscapes were created. Lewitt Falls didn't exist before the eruption. It's a warm waterfall, mixing waters coming off the glacier with the warm hot springs from the mountain. And this is just a magisterial photograph, beautifully composed. And as you can see, almost black and white, except for that one patch. Here we are a mile from the lava dome, and life is returning. Cook and Jensel, again, showing a herd of Roosevelt elk. I love this photograph because of the beautiful warm tones of their pelts, and set against the beautiful warmth emanating from the sun, and the animals juxtaposed against the coolness of the earth tones. And I used this image for a post on our social media platforms last Friday. It seemed an appropriate one. We're all blanketed in smoke now. And I decided Buzzy has made quite a wonderful body of work. You should visit his website as well. And this work I thought we should include at the end of the exhibition, because it shows the Toutle River Valley with life returning, vegetation, trees growing, but seen through the smoke of the Diamond Creek fire of 2017. This was a wildfire started by careless campers up near the Canadian border in north central Washington. But for me, this was an important photograph to include because it shows that we are having an awesome effect on the landscape. The last work in the exhibition is this large 11-foot wide canvas by Cameron Martin. Cameron was born and raised in Seattle, knew the mountain well. He remembers when it blew. He was 10 at the time. And this is his largest work to date. He's been living in Brooklyn, New York now for quite some time and is head of the painting department at the Bard Graduate Center. It depicts the volcano in essentially 3 colors: black, gray, and white. And when we look at it, it plays on all kinds of subliminal associations. The Paramount Pictures logo, embedded in all of our brains from years in the movies, as well as postcard images of the mountain made since the eruption. And you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs online that people have made that show essentially the same view, although almost all of these are taken from farther to the west. These are basically all made in the vicinity of the Johnston Observatory. This point of view is farther to the east. There you see, from this USGS photograph by Lynn Topinka, made 2 years after the great eruption, and that Spirit Lake in the foreground. And so we see this tiny, by comparison to what's developed, lava dome. The lava dome has, remember, the eruptions went on till 2008, and the lava dome has been destroyed and rebuilt numerous times. But in this case, when we view this image, it's not really something that you can appreciate at home on a screen like this. You need to be in the galleries, because from a distance, the black reads as solid. But as you approach this canvas, the black shifts to read as void. And so it's very difficult for the eye to compensate for this. It's confusing. And in this way, in purely visual terms, the artist expresses the instability of the mountain. That's also, of course, reflected in the title, Remission, where he likens the mountain to a human body with an incurable disease that will inevitably return. It is a very profound work, and we're delighted to have it here in Portland. The exhibition includes a wonderful learning space created by our Learning and Community Partnerships department, Stephanie Parrish and Jaleesa and friends, working with our partners at the Mount St. Helens Institute, the Forest Service, and the USGS. And so if you're able to come in and visit, you'll be delighted with this experience that will give context to the works of art in the show. For those of you who don't feel ready to come to the museum just yet, I can refer you to our virtual exhibition online. And if you don't remember this link, just go to our website, click on exhibitions, then current exhibitions, and you will find the Volcano show, and you'll be able to leaf through the show, all but about 10 works. There were 10 photographs in the exhibition that we weren't able to get high quality images of during the pandemic. We hope to add those eventually, but you'll get a very good idea of what it was like to experience the exhibition. So, back to Jaleesa.
Awesome. Thank you, Dawson. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. Something that I forgot to mention at the beginning is for anybody who's viewing this in the Zoom webinar, if you have any questions for Dawson, please enter them into the Q&A box. There's a little icon for Q&A. Please enter them there. And then if you are watching this program on Facebook Live, please enter your questions into the chat. And I have a colleague that will feed those questions over this way. And so just to give people some time to enter questions, if they have any, I actually have a question for you, Dawson. And maybe it's because of the current moment that we're in with all the smoke and the fires, but I'm just curious for you about how this show shifted your perspective, your relationship to nature and to even the darker parts of nature while putting it together. I'm just curious.
I should say that the exhibition started out as a general overview of volcano imagery in world art. And it was fairly late in the process, about 18 months before we opened, that it finally dawned on me that we were fast approaching the 40th anniversary. And at that point, we just decided this is silly, we should shift and we should concentrate on our local volcano. I should answer your question in part by saying that one of the things that drew me to Portland was the opportunity to live with the great volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest. I've been a volcano nerd since I was a boy, just thinking they were the coolest things. And I grew up in flat Miami, Florida, about as far away in the lower 48 as you can get. And so it's been thrilling. And one of the very first things I did after arriving was make the drive up to the Johnston Observatory, where I've returned many times. And every time I go, I'm overwhelmed by the visual experience. For many people who lived in our area and knew the mountain before, they see it now as really an ugly thing compared to what it once was. And I do understand that for those who had lost cabins, lost people, it's difficult thing. But when I look into that vast amphitheater of a space with the lava dome, and now at least this far south, the only growing glacier in the world around it, I'm moved every single time. It's an awesome experience, and it has a kind of haunting beauty all of its own. So for me, there was a steep learning curve. I've never worked on an exhibition of an artist who hasn't been dead for at least 100 years. So it was truly wonderful to be able to meet artists, talk with artists, get to know them a bit. And that was the greatest thrill for me in doing the exhibition. But to get to the heart of your question, I don't think that I quite understood at the start about the regeneration part. Naturally, driving up there, you get a sense of nature rebounding. But the part that I didn't understand was that our intense interest in the eruptions of 1980 stem from people like you and me coming to this area very recently. For Native Americans, these stories go back into deep time. And it's something that's happened again and again, and something that Native Americans certainly understood, that yes, there is destruction at the beginning, but then fertilization and rejuvenation. And you can see it. For those listening who have not been up to the Johnston Observatory, do plan to go and visit at some point. It is possible to social distance up there. But even if you wait until a vaccine has been developed, it is a truly wonderful experience.
Thank you, Doc.
And one other thing I should plug, the Mount St. Helens Institute. You should check out their website. They produce wonderful programs around the mountain. They issue permits and the like for climbing it, but also a great part of their program is education.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, we have partnered with them quite a bit throughout this exhibition, and they're awesome. They're really
They are awesome. And I'll pay a special tribute to Abby Grosskopf, who kept me accurate in my prose.
So we do have 2 audience questions. So one question is, hi, what was the name of the artist before Eliza Barcus? It was Grace Russell, but I didn't get her last name.
Grace Russell Fountain. And she's a truly distinguished Portland artist. Eventually, she and her husband moved to California, but she was in the area for quite a long time. And I have to say, that beautiful luminous picture is one of my favorites in the show.
And then another question that we have, I was wondering about the painting of the men looking at Mount St. Helens from the West Hills. Was this also a comment about the destruction of nature by man, or was it about prosperity and development of a growing urban area?
I would think, considering the date, I would certainly think it was the latter. That the destruction of man, I think in the 1880s, that really was not in many people's minds at that point. But the wonderful thing about works of art is that works of art depend upon a pair of eyes and a mind behind those eyes. And interpretations of works of art can evolve over time. And so it's certainly possible to think about those issues of man's destruction. And of course, that view, there's a lot more of man visible from that point. And where those gentlemen are looking out on the landscape. All of that now is developed.
And another question that came up. I love mountains in artworks and have painted many through Android digital art and wonder where galleries will go with digital art, especially now during pandemic times.
I'm not sure I understand. Jaleesa, can you help me?
I'm thinking because we have an online exhibition of the work of everything that was physically made, I'm wondering if this audience member is sort of thinking about if we continue with, continuing how long the pandemic continues to expand, and we continue with online exhibitions, will there be an incorporation of more digital based art because it will already be an online exhibition? That's my interpretation of the question.
Indeed. And this is, we've all learned from this experience, as well as the alienating part of it. We've learned how to use this kind of technology. And look, one of the great silver linings in the pandemic for me is that we had a financial downturn, loss of income more than a year before we opened. And the publication we were planning was cut as a result. And so we very quickly, after we closed, started working on trying to get the exhibition online for people to enjoy. And we learned a lot in the process. Now the Robert Colescott show is also online. Julia Dolan's exhibition, Though There Be Fury on the Waves, Victor Jorgensen's photographs. So we've been doing this more and more, and we'd love to be able to do it because it would be a great service to all those people who either can't afford to visit us or who don't live close enough to visit us. And so we'd love to continue this. The problem is, of course, is people power. And we're feeling that so much, as you well know, Jaleesa, at this point in time, because we've lost so many of our colleagues. But in time, I think lots has been learned, and I do think these online virtual exhibitions will probably continue once we are able to gather again. Do we have any more questions?
Well, we actually have a comment. Someone said, "Thank you. This has been wonderful. As soon as the smoke clears, I'll come visit the exhibit."
That's great. And I just like to make one final comment of a personal nature. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last time I'll be addressing the Art and Conversation audience. You've been so wonderful over the years. All of the curators at the museum love the Art and Conversation group so much for your enthusiasm, for coming out in such numbers every time, and for your wonderful questions at the end as well. But I'm retiring at the end of the year, but this is not goodbye, because as soon as we're able to gather together again, I'll be out there with you in the audience watching as well. So I will see you again.
Oh, thank you, Dawson. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and allowing us to hear this talk.
Thank you all very much. Those of you who feel that you can do it, come and pay us a visit. We're not overwhelmed with visitors at this moment, and so social distancing really is possible, in our galleries, and it's in many ways a very nice time to visit the museum because there are no crowds.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for attending Art and Conversation for this month. Thank you, Dawson. Please check out, if you're able to, check out the exhibit or even check it out online. Yeah, and with that, we will close. Thanks so much, Dawson. Thank you again.